I am Cindy Vanderweide, and I am going to talk to you about the beginnings of Maurice, Iowa. Maurice was named after Count Maurice, Prince of Orange, son of William the Silent. And to pronounce Maurice, M-A-U-R-I-C-E, when Mr. McNally was asked in 1907, he was the minister at the Catholic Church, he said, "We pronounce it Maurice when we have money and plenty. We pronounce it Morris when we are broke." So I guess we've been broke for a while because we usually say Morris. The population of Morris is about 270. The most it's been was about 330 people. So the beginnings of Morris, Iowa. In 1880, Thomas Foley purchased land in the prairies of Sioux County for $6 an acre. And people wondered why he was purchasing land so far from the railroad track. Well, in 1881, construction of the Toledo and Northwestern Railroad was progressing toward Mr. Foley's land. And in 1882, Thomas Foley sold his land for $20 an acre to Henry Hospers and the Western Town Lot Company, and Morris was plotted. And it was Henry Hospers who gave Morris the name Morris. In 1883, Mr. Plunkett and his wife had a little baby. They were owners of the hotel. They named their son Maurice, also after the town of Morris. And Sioux County attorney, Mr. Topasky from Sioux Center, named his son Maurice after the town of Morris. In the summer of 1882, the railroad was completed, and in October of that year, the depot was completed and the station established with J.E. Osborne as the first agent. This is a picture of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad depot. This was on the east side of Morris, along where the elevator now stands. And the depot is no longer there, and neither is the railroad track. This is just another picture of the Chicago Northwestern depot. In 1888, the Sioux City and Northern Railroad came through on the west side of Morris. And this one later became known as the Great Northern. And here's the Great Northern Depot, and this is no longer standing. The railroad track is still there. It belongs to Burlington Northern, and there are many trains that pass through on the west side of Morris yet. Well, with two railroads, people were sure Morris would be a metropolis and that it should be the county seat. But some of us are kind of glad it did not become that metropolis. This was written in one of the newspapers. "Since Morris is soon to be the railroad metropolis of Sioux County, she has perfect right to invite capitalists to visit the town and see for themselves that it is the most desirable point in the Northwest to engage in manufacturing industries. And Sioux Center can howl with envy as much as she likes, but it won't solace its wounded heart in the least." So sorry about that, Sioux Center, but Morris did have the railroads, and now Morris also has the airport. This was written in the Sioux County Herald. Not everybody liked our town being so quiet. They wrote this in 1887. "Morris is becoming noted for the quiet and Christian-like spirit of its inhabitants. No quarreling, no fighting, everything runs smoothly, and it seems like Sunday all the time. Rats," they said. But I like our quiet Sunday-like feel in the town of Morris. So we're going to talk about some of the first pioneers of Morris. And this is George Van Persum. And he was one of the first farmers to settle near Morris in Sherman Township. He came in 1872. And life was rough then. They had 3 years of crop failure because of the grasshoppers. So he was ready to leave, as some farmers had already done. But Henry Hospers encouraged him to stay, and he did. And he was very influential in the beginnings of First Reformed Church of Morris. And this is his family, and some of his descendants are still farming and engaged in Morris. Another pioneer was Alonson Sherman, and he also came in the 1870s and homesteaded. And in 1882, he built the first house in Morris. And this house is still standing on the corner of 3rd and Elm Street. He also began a post office out of his house and sold real estate and insurance. When he ran the post office, his daughter Mary would ride her horse to Orange City twice a week to get the mail, and she got paid $2 a month. Alonzo Sherman had served in the Civil War, and because of the hardships of the soldier life, it was hard for him to do manual labor. This is Sarah Everhart. Sarah and her husband James homesteaded a mile west and a half mile south of Morris. Her husband sometimes was known as Squire Everhart because he was Justice of the Peace. Well, in 1882, when they were selling the town lots, Mrs. Everhart was there, and she was first in line. So she bought the first lot in town, but their house was the second house that came up. And it was right across the street from the Alonzo Sherman house. It's where Nell DeGoyer lives now. And it was torn down in 1924. They also ran a boarding house and a general store and had some other businesses. Miss Everhart was quite a bold lady, but she had some rough experiences in life. Her mother passed away when she was 8 years old, and her father when she was 12. So her sister and her came to Iowa in the 1850s, and Iowa was pretty much just a prairie then, but they settled in DeWitt, Iowa, and Sarah was able to get an education there, and she married E.W. Preston. And he actually served under General Sherman in the Civil War and was taken prisoner, and he passed away in the prison camp. And that left Sarah with some children, and she was on her own again. But through school teaching, she was able to make enough money to take care of her and her children. And then she married Mr. Everhart, and they came to the town of Morris. This is 2nd Street in early Morris. This picture is 1908. And these all these 4 buildings here, all made out of wood. This tall one we're going to talk about is John Lynch. It's Lynch Hall, and it was built by John Lynch, as well as this building here. John Lynch was one of the first carpenters in Morris. He helped build the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church and other buildings. And in 1912, these 4 buildings were burned down. In Lynch Hall, there was a restaurant in the basement and a grocery store on the main floor. Lynch Hall had served as a place, a polling or a place where you would do your voting. It was a place where meetings would take place. They also did shows. But when the fire started in the restaurant in 1912, Lynch Hall burned down, as well as the Joe Douglas Barber Shop and Pool Hall. This was the J.C. Harrison Pharmacy that burned down, as well as Hoosingville's grocery store. And this brick building was the Times building. That stayed standing, and because it was made out of bricks. Note this pole. We'll make reference to that a couple times in our talk now. So 2 other first-time members, pioneers in Morris, were Henry Mensink and his wife Susan. They settled a mile east of Morris, and Henry helped survey Sherman Township. He wrote about riding in a wagon with a white tag tied to the wheel to count the revolutions. And in 1886, he moved to Morris and formed a partnership with William Bainham in general merchandise. His wife was Susan Maurice, and we'll talk about the Maurice family a little later. Their daughter, Maud, married Dr. Aggo. And Dr. Aggo was the doctor in Morris from 1903 to 1956 for 53 years. He retired at the age of 87, and he delivered over 2,000 babies. Some other doctors, early doctors, were O.D. Wilson in 1888 and Edward Warnheis. His father was a minister in Alton, and when young Edward Warnheis was working at the pharmacy in Alton, the pharmacist realized he had a real good mind for medicine and encouraged him to go to the medical field, which he did. And so he became the doctor in Morris, but after being doctor for only 2 years, he contacted a sickness and passed away, leaving behind a young wife who was pregnant with their first child. Robert Foster was the doctor in Morris in 1900, and he was also the health officer for Sherman Township in southern Sioux County, so he had jurisdiction over the poor farm. Mr. Foster was from Canada. In early Morris, there were many Dutch, but there was also Germans and Scottish and Irish and some from Canada as well. This is P.H. Moran. P.H. stood for Patrick Henry, and he doesn't look like a farmer. He looks more like a politician, I think, and he was elected as our first mayor of Morris in 1891. He served many years as mayor, and he did a lot of legal and clerical work, sold insurance. He also had a grocery store for a while and just was very involved with the town. This is Henry Garrison and his family. Henry Garrison came from Howland when he was 4 years old, and he and his family made their way to Morris in 1882, and Henry Garrison was one of the first carpenters. He built many of the first buildings in town. He was also a photographer, and he was involved in Morris First Reformed Church as well, especially being Sunday school superintendent for many years. And his wife was Johanna Maurice. She was a sister to Susanna Maurice. He also built the first parsonage for First Reformed Church. And he and his son, William, established the Morris Furniture Store. And this is on 2nd Street, the same street that those buildings that had burned down, but this would be on the west end of 2nd Street, where MTR stands now. This was his furniture store, and this was his photography shop. And in the back, you can see a J, and that was for the J.H. Quell Lumber Yard, which we will talk about later. Henry Garrison and his family moved with 70 other Dutch families to Yakima Valley in Washington State in about 1900. Then we come to the Maurice family. So there were 3 brothers who came to Morris in the 1880s. They were William and Corinne Maurice and their children, and 2 of their children we talked about. It was Susanna and Johanna Garrison. And then Jacob and Adriana and their children came. And John E. was one of their children. And Adrian and Dina Maurice was another brother that came. So John E. Maurice was postmaster from 1898 to 1942 for 44 years. He also ran the telephone office, and he was also in the hardware business. And he was editor of the Morris Times for a few years. So he did a lot of work in Morris. And he lived where Dorothy Vanderweyden now lives. When he moved into that house, it was a 4-room cottage, and he built it up to be the 2-room house, the 2-story house that it is now. And he also ran the telephone office. This is John M. Maurice, and he was a cousin to John E. Maurice. He was a rural route carrier from 1903 to 1934. Morris was the second town in Sioux County to have rural route, Ireton being the first. So John M. Maurice delivered by horse and buggy, and later with his Model T. He was known for getting the mail delivered no matter the weather. Even if there was a snowstorm, and the horse couldn't get through the snow, he would stop the horse and he would walk the rest of the way to make sure the mail got to the house. He and his brother Johannes built this opera house in 1914. So Lynch Hall, which was the opera house, burned down, remember, in 1912. So they started the dirt work for this in 1914, in June of 1914, and by the following spring, they had this building up and ready to do shows in it. And they did plays in here. Later, they actually had a real movie theater in the opera house. They also had played basketball in there. And John M. also made cement blocks. He did a lot of cement work in the town of Morris, putting in sidewalks. And he began the Morris Power and Line Company with Henry DeYoung. And this opera house later became John Vanderstelt's upholstery shop in the late 1940s and 50s. Here's Henry DeYoung's light plant, which started in 1909. And this is William Maurice. This would be a brother to John E. And he and his other brother Jacob ran Maurice Brothers Hardware. William Maurice was also mayor of Morris in the 1900s and involved in different ways in the town. Many of these that we are talking about all served as probably on town council or mayor's school board. They were all very involved. G.W. Orton was also an early Morris pioneer. He worked in, had a grocery store and also worked in the elevator. And in 1898, he built a brick factory on the southwest corner of Morris. And most of the work was done by hand. The plant produced over 300,000 brick of good quality. And then he got more tools, and he equipped the plant with modern brick machinery and built a large engine and sheds and permanent kilns. And he was able to produce over 2 million bricks annually. His bricks were used for the courthouse in Orange City, as well as the Morris Bank and other buildings in Morris. This was written about G.W. Orton in one of the papers. There are 3 classes of businessmen in every town: men who build up, men who tear down, and men who drift along with the tide, whichever way it ebbs. G.W. Orton takes front rank among that class who forge ahead and blaze a path for others to follow. But his brick factory closed in 1915, more because of competition from some of the bigger plants out of Sioux City and other areas. But it was where our tree dump is now. That's why that's all dug out. That was the clay they used to make the bricks. But right to the south of the tree dump, there's a lot of brick remnants that you can still find. John Plunkett was another early pioneer to Morris. He came in 1883 and bought the lot on 2nd Street and Elm Street, the corner of 2nd Street and Elm Street, and he built the Morris Hotel. So in 1884, he built the south side here, and in 1888, he added this north half, and he boasted of having a hotel of 11 rooms. There were more owners to the Morris Hotel, one being Peter Vanderwicken, and he had made many changes. One of them, this door here, faces Elm Street, because in early Morris years, Elm Street was the street that had many of the businesses on. But later, 2nd Street and Main Street, a block to the west, become the main businesses of Morris. So he moved this door that faces Elm Street over here to this side to face 2nd Street. This is L. Verberg and his wife. L's mother was the daughter of Tiered Hoosman, who came from Pella to Sioux County. And they bought the hotel in 1924, and they were quite busy in the 30s as they were paving Highway 75. But in the 1940s, business slowed down, and they turned it more into apartments. Now, talking to his sons, when they did have it as a hotel, people would get off one train track and maybe come up and stay the night, or just come up to the hotel for a meal or a piece of pie and go to the other tracks to get on, depending on where they were heading. In 1949, John and Daisy Vanderwyde bought the hotel and lived in the north half and used the other half for apartments. And now my husband Jeff and I live here. We bought it in 1989. And here you can see that door that was on the east side is now on the south side, facing 2nd Street. Now we're going to talk about some of the early businesses of Morris. Well, with 2 railroad tracks, Morris also had 2 stockyards, and we actually had 4 elevators for a while, 2 of them on each track. The first one was Stubbs and Everhart, Mr. Everhart, who bought that first lot, and another one was Noble and Fitzpatrick. Luke Fitzpatrick also had a livery business in town. He was also the town marshal and constable And he had tried to begin an embryo packing plant, but that never took off. Shipping was too much. Some other elevators that were in town were Trans-Mississippi, the King's Elevator, and later Charlie Boyd and his brother and Dior Coase had the Morris elevator in the 50s. And this is a picture of that. And here on this picture, you can still see the depot is still there. And this would be the hotel. So these bins were taken down. And we have our cement bins now. In 1965, Orange City bought the Morris elevator and became Farmers or Midwest Farmers Co-op. And today it is Ag State. Well, we also had livery stables in town to take care of the horses. James McDonald was one of the first ones in 1873. His family farmed 2 miles south of town where Howard Flieger's farm is now, and the McDonald family owned that farm for 100 years. Another one was R.S. Maurer livery, and this was right on Main Street, across from the old church lot where Corey Vetzloten lives now. And this was the Pellis livery. This was owned by P.J. Lavelle. And there must have been some kind of celebration. It's kind of hard to see, but there is somebody on a tightrope here. You can see his pants. His white shirt kind of just blends in with the white building. And right here is the tightrope. J.T. Crowley also had a livery business on 2nd Street, and he also ran the dray wagon. We have some general stores that we're going to talk about now. The first ones were on Elm Street. Cluckhorn and Ricky from Lamar's had one there, which was right next to the hotel, just north of the hotel. And Call and Everhart had one on the corner of 2nd and Elm Street in the park where the little pump house stands now. William Huizenfeld also had a general store on Elm Street in 1890, and 3 years later that one burned down. And then Van Beinum and Boakes started one on Main Street. Here is the bank. The bank is still standing, and Van Beinum and Boakes building was right next to it. Well, Mr. Boakes sold his share out to Mr. Mensink, and it became Van Beinum and Mensink. And here's a picture of that. And then it became Mensink and Duvin, and they actually moved to 2nd Street. And this was before the 1912 fire when they moved to 2nd Street, so they were in the grocery store on that earlier picture that we had showed you, but they were not there during the fire. Mr. Huizenfeld bought the business in 1911 on 2nd Street, and he was one whose general store burned down in 1903. Well, in 1912, his second general store burned down. So then he made it out of brick. And this building here became the general store, and this one became J.C. Harrison's pharmacy. It's now the post office. Well, William Huizenfeld's son Cliff also had it as a grocery store, and he called it Hoosy's Groceries. And in 1958, Art and Harriet Holstein had it as a grocery store, called it A&H. Bill and Berdina Bleecker in 1962, and it was B&B. And then Dwayne Vanderwyde had Dwayne's Groceries. Here's an inside picture of Dwayne's grocery store. And for a little while, Otto Huizinga had it for a couple years. And now it is Lauren Ochsner's stained glass business, prairie glass business that he has in that store. And these two stores are both standing. They were what was built after the 1912 fire. Guy Orton, G.W. Orton, and Ed Orton also had a grocery store, and that was on Elm Street in early Morris, and that was later moved to Million Dollar Corner. This Million Dollar Corner by Morris. And John and Frank, two brothers from Larchwood, they had a grocery store first in the Van Beinum building, and then later they moved to Lynch Hall, and they had their grocery store in there when the fire burned down. Well, Morris also had hardware stores. And this is on the corner of 2nd and Main. So the bank would be over here. This was Van Beinum and Boakes, and this was a hardware store. Mr. Sherman, who built the first house, built this building also, and Williams Brothers had a hardware store in there, and they sold their business to Dave Kaufman, and he later sold it to the Maurice brothers, to Jacob and William, who were brothers to John E. Maurice, and it was Maurice Brothers Hardware. They sold it to Henry Coy, and he built a big warehouse on the west side of Main Street, and that burned down. Curtis Brothers also had a hardware store in 1888, and so did John E. Maurice and Henry DeYoung. And this is again on 2nd Street now. This would be probably in the same vicinity that Henry Garrison had his furniture store, that big wooden one, but it's taken down. Henry DeYoung built this cement building in 1905 or 1906 and put his hardware store in there. And they had it till about 1909 when they decided that they were going to put up the light plant. But here's another picture of Maurice and DeYoung Hardware. And here's the same picture with 1910 Jackson automobiles, all parked in front of Maurice and DeYoung. You can see the hotel is right over here. So this is just west of the hotel. And then Will Duvin had the same building for a furniture hardware as well as undertaking. And he eventually buys out this millinery building also and adds that to his furniture store. Well, in about 1914, Will Duvin got his license to be an undertaker. And I did some research, and there's actually Van Dyke Duvin Funeral Home in Pella, Iowa. And I found out that they are descendants of Will Duvin. Will's son Wilson was the one who went to Pella and joined Van Dyke in the funeral home. And the Wilson's son Roger joined him. And now Roger's daughter, Leah Duvin Hilma, is part of the Van Dyke Duvin Funeral Home. So I don't know if Will Duvin, when he got his undertaking license, knew that would continue on in the family for over 100 years. This is Henry Duvin and his wife. They're the parents of Will Duvin, and they also had another son, James Duvin, and he was very involved in Morris, also having an implement dealership, and he sold tractors and farm machinery as well as automobiles. And their daughter, Martha Byers, she had been in Leota until her husband passed away. Then she moved back to Morris, and she had a millinery shop. She had that on the corner of 2nd and Elm Street where Dustin and Sammy Vanderwhite live now. Mrs. Duvin would tell a story of one day an Indian lady had walked to their house, and she needed a cup of flour. So Mrs. Duvin gave her a cup of flour, asked her to sit down for a cup of coffee, but this Indian lady said no, she had to get back home because she had a baby during the night. So, wow, she was ready to go right after that, I guess. This is Maurice and Van Persum hardware store, and this was on the Times building, that big brick building. They added a piece on, and they had a hardware store in there. They sold to Wilbur Kotz, who moved across the street to this building. Now, this building is the same building that was the Kaufman Hardware and the Van Beinum General Store. But in the 1920s, Henry Warnches bought both buildings and turned it into one big building, had a general store in there. And then Mr. DeGroot had a general store. And then Wilbur Kotz put his hardware store in, and then it ended up being Brink's hardware store. Well, we also needed blacksmiths in town. So our first blacksmith in Morris was Mike Schauer in 1884, and he repaired wagons, plows, and other machinery. And this is a picture of George Bell, and he had his blacksmith shop where Dustin and Sammy live now. So this was before Mrs. Byers had her millinery shop there. This was way early Morris in the 1880s. And one of the papers said this about Mr. Bell. Mr. Bell is one of the leading and enterprising citizens of Morris. He takes a keen interest in the welfare of town and is always ready to lend a hand in public enterprise. It is of such men as Mr. Bell that the best towns are made. I thought that was quite a compliment. Mr. Bell was Scottish, and I'm thinking he was not married because this was written in one of the papers. It said, George Bell, Sunday to Lamar's. We would advise George to look out, or his Calliope girl might get on the warpath. I thought that was kind of cute, and I was surprised they would put things like that in the paper. They didn't have to worry about offending anybody back then, I guess. The Scholler brothers also had a blacksmith shop on Main Street, and they sold to Sharda and Taco Stellingworth. And this building is still standing on Main Street. And Taco Stellingworth was the last blacksmith of Maurice. Well, of course, if all the building was going up, we needed some lumber yard. So E.S. Downs had a lumber yard for a while, and so did Stubbs and Everhart, who built that first, or bought the first lot, Mr. Everhart. And they sold to J.H. Quell and Company in 1883. And this was just north of the hotel, as we saw the J in that one picture. It was a big building. And J.H. Quell sold out to Thompson Yards in 1918. Well, as we were redoing some work on the old hotel, since we live there now, we found a couple boards that had J.H. Quell, Morris, Iowa written on them. And my son Dustin was doing some work on their house, Mrs. Byers' old house. He found a board that said Thompson Yards, Morris, Iowa. So for a while, Morris was without a lumber yard, and then Van Eisinga from Orange City put a branch office in. And this was just north of the hotel also. So they're not sure if the J.H. Quell building burned down or what, but this is the new lumber yard then from Van Eisinga. And in 1965, they sold to Farmers Co-op, and Farmers Co-op later moved it to this big building here, which is still standing. And this was built for grain storage for the elevator, but they used it for their lumber yard. It is no longer a lumber yard now anymore. Well, Morris also needed some banks, and it took a little bit to get the banking business going, but with the help of Henry Hospers in the 1890s, they were able to get a substantial bank started and going. And in 1889, the Brick Bank was built, and A.J. Kuiper and P.N. Voss were the first cashiers. And Mr. Voss had some exciting times in the bank. A couple bank robberies. The first one was 1923. And this was written in one of the papers about that. It said, shortly after 1 o'clock last Friday morning, the train dispatcher from the Great Northern Railway in Sioux City found it impossible to communicate with the night operator at Sioux Center over direct wire. By a roundabout way, he advised him of this fact. The Sioux Center operator, suspicious that trouble was at Morris, promptly advised Sheriff Seinhorst of Orange City by telephone. So Sheriff Seinhorst and Deputy Harry Dykstra and Dr. Fisher took off in their car for Morris. As soon as the deputies and the sheriff stepped out of the car, they were greeted with a charge of gunfire from a man across the street. And so gunfire had continued for about 30 minutes because there were five bank robbers, three from Sioux City, one from Chicago, one from Louisville, Kentucky. And the paper says Sheriff Seinhorst was shot 17 times. Not sure if that's true because he was he was okay. And one of the robbers was shot one time, but the car was shot up quite badly. So they took off, but they didn't get too far with their car because it ran out of radiator fluid. And the next day, all five men were captured and brought to the Orange City jail. When the health examiner was examining the one who was shot, it said that the bullet actually fell out of his underwear, so it didn't really even penetrate into his skin. And then later on, it said that half of Ironton came to Orange City just to check out the notorious gangsters that had robbed the Morris Bank. So another one was quite a bold raid, and this one happened in 1931. It was right in the daylight. It was right after the bank opened. And this is what the paper said about this one. It said, two well-dressed young fellows entered the bank just as P.N. Voss was emerging from the vault with a tray full of money. When he came out, one of the bandits was covering him with a gun, and Mr. Van Persum, who had the hardware store across the street and was a customer there, was hit over the head with a gun barrel. When he was a little slow to put up his hands, Mr. Voss, Mr. Van Persum, and cashier Herman Rowenhorst were made to lay on the floor behind the counter. When Mr. Voss threw himself on the floor, he managed to conceal a package containing $200 in currency. In his nervousness and haste, the thief, who was behind the counter, missed $87 in silver dollars and instead took packages containing 2,800 pennies and overlooked about $500. The alarm was given shortly after the robbers had left, and Mr. Voss notified Sheriff Seinhorst, who arrived at 9:25 with Deputy Dykstra just about 10 minutes after the robbers had left. And those robbers took a little bit longer, but they both were captured also. And Northwestern bought the bank in 1933, and then it closed in 2013, and we still use the building as the book bank. And this bank was built with the bricks from the Maurice brick factory, and here you can see those two old buildings that were the general store and the hardware store. They are no longer standing there. But the book bank is a fun place for everybody to come to, kids and adults. It is a library, but it's not a quiet library. But we do have over 10,000 books you can check out, and it's all run by volunteers, and it's just a fun place to take the kids. Well, Maurice also had restaurants. One of the first ones was Tom Adams in 1884. And Matt Vanderploeg in 1909 had Van's Cafe. And then John Sculver, who was the blacksmith, after he sold to Sharda and Taco Stellingworth, he opened a restaurant in 1916 called Star's Cafe, and he advertised pie a la mode for 10 cents. This is Wimpy's Lunch. That was on the west side of Main Street. And then Rich DeYoung, he bought the Times building, the big brick building and hardware store, and he put a bowling alley in there. So he had a bowling alley and a cafe. Many of the men at Maurice, their first job as young boys was setting up pins in this bowling alley. And this was also run by Wayne and Dina Rankin, called Dina's Cafe. Ari and Ruth Strauss had it for a while. Herman Chris Van Dunkler had it as it was just corner cafe. They didn't have the bowling alley, but here we have this pole again. It's the same pole that was there for the Times building. Jim Smits had it, and the last to own it was Arlen Sandbolt. He bought it in 1983, but in 1986, a fire started inside, and it burned the Times building, the old brick building, down. So it had survived the fire of 1912, but not the fire of 1986. But the pole did, and now we still have our pole in the park, the little corner park there with a lamp on top. Well, we no longer have our horses, but now we have automobiles, and we need some garages for those. So this was the building that was the Dubin Furniture Store, or Maurice and DeYoung Furniture Store. It is now a gas station and a mechanic shop. Abe Levering had it first, and then Garrett Kaminga had it. This was Van's service. Abe Van Ruckel was the owner in 1959. He sold to Frank Croyd in 1982, and then Frank sold it to Isaac Holtrop in 2003, and it is now MTR and owned by Isaac Holtrop. Maurice also had a truck service for a while because we don't need the dray wagon. Now we have trucks to deliver. Abe Levering again and Henry DeYoung, who had the light plant and furniture store at one time, they started the truck business from 1920s to 1930. And then Henry's son Rich, who also had the bowling alley and cafe, became an owner of it with Roscoe Bohr. And Maurice has his churches also. One of the first ones built was St. Mary's Catholic Church, and that began in 1884. They bought the lot from Henry Hospers for $250, And they had a committee consisting of Peter Cribben as well as Luke Fitzpatrick, who had the embryo plant in the elevator, and James McDonald, who had the livery station. And their first Mass was read on August 15, 1884. And this church was built with the help of John Lynch, that first carpenter. Father O'Reilly was the first father, and Patrick O'Hare Sr. donated the land where the St. Mary's Cemetery is now, just south of town. This is Maurice Reformed Church, and it also started in 1884. Said the pioneers of Sherman Township would travel to Orange City to worship, or they would hold worship services in the Van Horsen or Vanderstoep schoolhouses. So in 1884, it was decided that they would like their own building, and so they built that in the town of Maurice. And George Van Person was, as we said, was very influential in bringing this to the town of Maurice. And the first service was held October 23, 1884. Reverend Boer was the first pastor. The first elders were George Van Person and Cornelius de Boer, and the first deacons were Henry Mensink and Garrett Brink. And Garrett Brink's family also had a long history of descendants in the Maurice area, and very involved in the town and community, and still has descendants there. This is what the church looks like now, and it's on the corner of 4th and Main. The first church was just to the south of it, across the street from 4th Street. This is the Methodist Church. So in the 1890s, with the help of John Lynch, they built this, the Methodists built this church out of bricks from the Maurice Brick Factory. The first trustees were Mrs. Everhart, Sarah Everhart, George Bell, who was the blacksmith, and George Elskamp. And Mr. Elskamp was also mayor of Maurice for a few years, as well as had a harness shop on Main Street and known for selling honey, his own honey. Well, this church closed in 1907, and it was about that time that some of the members of the Maurice First Reformed Church, also known as the Dutch Reformed Church, wanted an all English-speaking church. So they had been meeting in the school building, and then they were able to take possession of the Methodist Church and called it American Reform. Their first pastor was Reverend DeSpelder. The first elders were J.S. Maurice, who had the Maurice Brothers Hardware. Peter Van Persum, son of George Van Persum, also had the hardware store. The first deacons were J.M. Maurice, who was a rural carrier, and William Hoosingfeld, who had the general store. So we read some of the same names. Some of the same people were very active in Maurice. The Maurice also had a school. The first classes of schools were held in 1871 in the Van Horsen Schoolhouse, just 3 miles east of Maurice. Other classes were in 1879 with in the H.M. Henry Mensink Granary. And this granary was actually moved to Elm Street in Maurice, but later torn down. Vanderstoep Schoolhouse was 2 miles northeast of Maurice. In 1895, a 2-story schoolhouse was completed on the corner of 4th and Main, where the church stands now. But that was taken down, and in 1923, a brick schoolhouse was built. And the last high school graduation was in 1959, and the school was closed totally in 1978. And here is a more modern picture of it. I think when they're taking it down, because as you can see, one of the windows is taken out already. This playground equipment, the merry-go-round, and the teeter-totters, as well as the swings that are still being used today in the North Park of Maurice. So the church had wanted to buy the school, but Mr. Stellingworth had outbidded them, and he started taking the old school down and fell and actually passed away from his injuries. Well, the family they did not want the school, and they sold it back to the church then, and the church was still able to have the school. And you never know how God works, but part of the Maurice Reformed Church is part of the old school. And the school had the fire escape, which they use. Many of the older people talk about going down that fire escape. Well, we turned that into a fire escape slide at the Maurice Park. And young and old and people from Maurice and outside of Maurice come and enjoy the Maurice fire escape slide. we hear lots of stories working for the town of just the fun they have at the Morris Park. There was a family that passed through town last year. They were from Oklahoma, and they just happened to be passing through and needed a break, so they stopped in Morris and they started playing on the fire escape slide and merry-go-round and the big swings and big tater-totters that we have here. And they said this was the best part of their vacation. And we hear stories like that more often. People really enjoy the Morris Park. Well, I'm going to close today and just give honor to the 6 men from Morris who gave their lives for our freedom. And that would be Jake Levering, Greg Bosch, Herman Vanderlaan, Clarence Bohr, Nick Stellingworth, and B.J. Lusing. And we just want to say thank you.